Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to week 5 of our online museum management training brought to you by the Museo Kordilyera with the support of the Commission on Higher Education. Okay, so today we are now in the last week of our online webinar series. So we are pleased to have with us on a different time zone, Dr. Ethel Villafranca, who will give us a talk on museum education. Last week, we had a very engaging discussion on how to use your digital media for your museums. We had Miss Charisse Togade and Miss Everett Miranda who gave very practical tips on starting up your museums, no, going digital. So once you are in the digital platform and you have your curated exhibition, you also need to have museum programming, and part of that is your museum education. So, all right. So we would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Ethel Villafranca. Dr. Ethel is the curator and exhibitions manager of the Museum of Chinese Australian History. She has been involved in many exhibitions in various aspects of museum work or cultural work in the Philippines, the USA, and in Australia since 1998. She has held positions at the Ayala Museum and Lopez Museum and Library, as well as graduate internship roles at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, the Harn Museum of Art, and Florida Museum of Natural History. Dr. Ethel has a PhD from the University of Melbourne, a master's in museology, major in education from the University of Florida, and a bachelor's degree in Philippine arts, major in arts management from the University of the Philippines in Manila. Her PhD research, entitled Curated Learning, focused on identifying teaching strategies of museums that school teachers can adopt to help students engage in deep learning. She has been awarded a number of prestigious international academic and professional scholarships, including the Fulbright Scholarship, Asian Cultural Council Fellowship, and Melbourne International Research Scholarship. She is the principal author of Making Museums Work, a Zero Handbook. It's the first comprehensive and practical handbook on establishing and managing museums in the Philippines. So without further ado, let's say hello to Dr. Ethel. She's now in Melbourne on a different time zone.
Hi
Good morning,
everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon
Ethel.
in my time.
Okay, so it's good morning in the Philippines. So, okay, so we will start your presentation on museum
Yes.
education. Thank you.
Let me just share my screen. There we go. Does that work? All right. So here we go. So good morning to everyone, and thank you to Ikin and Museo Kordilyera for inviting me to participate and engage with the participants of the museum management training for higher education institutions. So what I'm going to do today is I was asked to respond to 3 questions. So how museums complement pedagogy, how educators use museums for deep learning, and lastly, how important it is for HIEs to integrate learning in museums in their curriculum. So this presentation will be a mixture of both theoretical and practical information. So while the theoretical part may be boring, it is important for us to go through that so we can understand why we do certain things and why they work. So I will not cover public programs because Maya Angsi and Dr. Cecil de la Paz will talk about that tomorrow. So instead, I will concentrate heavily on student teaching and learning in museums. So in order to teach in museums, it is critical for us to understand how students learn in museums first. While there is a whole plethora of research on learning in museums, I will only focus on studies that are relevant to student learning in museums. So if you notice, I shifted from using education to learning. Many museums now prefer to use the term learning instead of education. So education programs, now many museums would call it learning programs. Why? Because the term education connotes that these programs were designed for school children or those who still require formal education. There is the more traditional connotation of learning as a passive binary didactic way of learning, of student learning. So there are numerous studies that have provided significant evidence that students learn in museums. So you can look at works of Falk and Dirking, Hersey, Hooper Greenhill, just to name a few. I won't go through that in this presentation. However, several studies provided evidence that school field trips in particular to museums result to long-term impact on students. So these are works particularly by Falk and Dirking. And they found that these experiences, especially those who were still in primary school, are very salient experiences. They still remember, these students still remember their experience many years later. So as a result of the museum visits, students benefited educationally by gaining new knowledge, skills, and inspiration. According to Hersey, museum visits could assist students in developing qualities that will not only impact their test scores. So even John Dewey, who is a prominent leader in progressive education in the US, who was a prominent leader in progressive education in the US, his vision of a model school included a museum. However, his idea for a school's museum was less of a static display, but more of a hands-on workshop type of learning space. So I am a big fan of Falk and Dirking's research, and they are the major proponents of contextual model of learning. If you are someone interested in museum education, their works are what you should explore. So Falk and Dirking proposed a theoretical framework that maps out learning in museums. The contextual model of learning suggests that learning is influenced by the interplay of the following three distinct contexts: the personal context, the sociocultural context, and the physical context. Decisions made by the museum visitors are filtered through the personal context, mediated by the sociocultural context, and embedded within the physical context. So Falk and Dirking recognized that while learning is prompted by personal motivation and emotional cues, these are still facilitated by personal interests. Visitors' personal interests dictate the paths that they follow in viewing the exhibition, as well as the specific objects they choose to examine. Secondly, a museum visit is seen as a social activity. The sociocultural context positions learning as both an individual and group experience, because individuals do not learn in isolation. And lastly, the physical context explains that learning occurs through an individual's interaction with the physical world. Sight, sound, odors, and sensation all contribute to the museum learning experience. So the contextual model of learning is not just about student learning in museums, but I'm using this as a lens with which to understand student learning. It applies their theory applies to learning in museums in general. So aside from the three contexts, Falk and Stordijk identified 12 other factors that influence the learning in museums. And I won't go through specific details of this, but the bottom line is that it's not just the learning space, it's not just the galleries, it's not just the museum educator, it's not just the student, but a diversity of interconnected factors that influence the way students, the how and the why students learn in museums. Okay, so now I'll go to how our first question: how do museums complement pedagogy? And to answer this, I will share with you part of the research that I did. So when I was doing my research, my PhD research, I went through a review of literature, so existing research studies on facilitated student learning in museums. So I focused only on learning programs that were not self-directed, that there was someone actively facilitating the learning exercise, the learning activities of students in particular. So first, in a traditional learning situation, such as in a classroom, the teacher is considered the authority figure. This is particularly true in the Philippines. However, teaching in other informal learning environments, such as museums, has the potential to disrupt this power dynamic. So a study by Frelin and Granes found that places outside classrooms blur and make the fixed relational conditions between teachers and students ambiguous. The word potential is key because some museum educators still teach the way they were taught traditionally in their school. And they still follow the familiar teacher-student script where the teacher is considered the expert and the student is relegated to being a novice. What works better is when educators act as a guide or facilitator for students' learning. Instead of being the expert, the educator should take on the role of a co-explorer or someone who encourages students to question, challenge, and formulate their own ideas, opinions, and conclusion. So one study done by someone overseas, I forgot which museum in particular, Kenkman, she teaches German language, but she brought her students to an art museum. So again, they're not studying art; they're studying German language. So she noticed that when she brought her students to an art museum, the students were more open to expressing their opinions. They gave more spontaneous responses and were less worried about making mistakes. In her case, the traditional expert-novice structure was disrupted because since she is not an art expert, remember, she's teaching German language. She and her students were almost on a level playing field. The second one is that students are given more control over their learning. So according to Falk and Dirking again, students learn better when they are given a greater sense of control over their own learning. Another researcher based in Australia, Griffin, argues that giving students a choice on what they will be learning and allowing them to choose how to record information they are collecting lead to better learner engagement. So a separate study done by Groundwater, Smith, and Kelly, a group of students identified completing detailed worksheet as an impediment to learning. So they didn't like that they were focused on finding answers to finding answers in the museum during their tour, during their activity, so that they can answer the worksheets. So they felt that it prevented them from exploring the exhibitions on their own. So just a caveat, not all museum worksheets are created equal. This does not mean that they do not work or that you shouldn't make them. You just have to put more thought or in when you are developing effective museum worksheets. Third, the same researcher, Groundwater Smith and Kelly, identified that students' enjoyment from learning with and from their peers as one of those factors that was helpful in facilitating students' learning. The importance of social interactions to learning is reflected in both social constructivism and contextual model of learning that I just discussed a few minutes ago. By enabling students to work together, they can learn from each other. And in contributing individual members' prior knowledge to the collective knowledge of the group, students have the opportunity to see different perspectives about one concept or different points of view about certain issues. So for instance, at the Project Muse, which is Museums Uniting with Schools and Education, in their study, they reported that students saw more details in an art print when they took turns in verbally sharing out loud their observations, and they noticed details that they normally would not have seen if they were working on their own. Working with other students forced them to articulate their thoughts, concept, insights, and questions. So Project Muse was a Harvard Graduate School of Education's project that involved museum educators, school teachers, and principals from the USA and other countries in Asia, Europe, Australia, North America, and South America. The goal was to investigate the students' process of learning in art museums. So the fourth one is the museum as a unique learning. The museum as a unique learning environment is maximized. So the immersive quality of museum exhibitions transports the visitor into a different time and place, real or imagined, by putting them inside a three-dimensional representation of this world. Immersive environments engage multiple senses of visitors. Some museums exploit sound, sight, smell, touch, and even taste to create the illusion of being somewhere else. Emerging scholarships support the idea that engaging multiple senses lead to a better acquisition and retention of new concepts, knowledge, and ideas. So another previous study done by Falk and Deerking indicate that when asked to remember their museum experience, most individuals, even after 20 or 30 years, could still easily recall what they saw, what they did, and felt during their visit. In a 2016 study done by Mulcahy from the University of Melbourne, she focused on which was focused primarily on primary school students who visited specific exhibitions in 3 different museums here in Melbourne. She found that affective learning in museums leaves a lasting impression, one that is potentially transformative in nature. Additionally, Lord stressed that the value of museum experience lies in the affective and transformative quality of the experience because of its potential to change visitors' attitudes, interest, appreciation, and belief. Now, what set museums apart from other informal learning venues are objects or artifacts. Objects, according to Lubar and Kendrick, tell their own stories. They connect people, they may mean many things, they capture moments and reflect changes. Artifacts bring memories to life and make history real. Kirk asserted that because museums are rich storehouse of resources, of evidence, of sources, and of artifacts, they are well positioned to support the kind of teaching and learning that modern education requires. The unique power of objects in conveying ideas has long been recognized in the museum field. Learning from real things in real places, talking, handling, discussing, reviewing, comparing, recording, and presenting according to Hooper Greenhill are methods used by museum educators on a daily basis. So, object-based learning, or OBL, which utilizes principles of active and experiential learning, was initially restricted to students um, in archaeology or geology. But OBL has now been employed as a teaching method in other disciplines such as medicine, biology, journalism, and business management. A study in the University College of London, they found that 61% out of the 154 students that they surveyed considered OBL as a more effective way of learning compared to listening to teachers talking or delivering lectures. So at the University of Melbourne, they have dedicated OBL laboratories as well as object displays in corridors, foyers, and other spaces. This is a photo of one laboratory, one OBL laboratory in Arts West building, which was opened in 2016. This these laboratories and displays are intended to provide students with the opportunity to develop skills through practical experience and exploration in order to complement formal learning methods such as lectures. The building was specifically designed, as I mentioned, this was just opened in 2016. It was designed with OBL in mind. So if you look at the photo, the this the side, the wall, the one at the back, those are actually display cases. They are locked display cases, and you can change the content. And in front, the table, you will see a desk, and they have a camera that allows that captures. So if, for example, the lecturer is holding an object or has an object on the desk, they have a camera that focuses on that, so that the students who are sitting in the room can see that, so that image is projected on the wall behind the desk. So these are the hallways that I was talking about earlier. So aside from the particular OBL laboratory, which is, by the way, climate controlled, and climate and so temperature and so it's climate controlled, and also the lighting is also controlled. So in the hallway, they have also these display cases. And just to clarify, these are not part of the university's museums. The museum has several other museums on campus, I think around 12 of them. So in organizing this display, so these are located in hallways or corridors of the building. They have a curator who work with historians, archaeologists, art historians, conservators, and designers. These display cases are temporary and they change depending on the semester. So the curator works with different faculty members to identify possible displays that are aligned with what are being offered by the university during that semester. So I think it was mentioned by Cecil that they work with different faculty members in LaSalle, Cecil Gelecame, that they work with faculty members in developing exhibitions. And Dr. Patrick Flores also mentioned collaborating with other faculties for exhibitions at the museum. So if you, so the way, I mentioned that the University of Melbourne has about 12 museums, as far as I remember. Recently, they revamped the structure. So these individual museums are used to be independent museums, but they organized in such a way that now there's an overarching structure that governs the different museums and collections. Some of the collections don't have permanent spaces. So if you go to the website of the museum, this is the Museum and Collections Unit of the university. They have a focus on teaching and learning. So aside from these OBL laboratories, the university's cultural collections are also used for teaching and learning, as well as embedded in a number of curriculum areas across the university. If you click on Teaching with Unique Collection, the last one, it'll show you this page, which has options that focuses on specific objects that are part of the collection. And if you click further, you'll see that they have, I think it's a little bit small, but you will see that they have the basic information about the object, and then there are teaching ideas about this object. So how they align with specific aspects or specific topics under different courses offered by the museum. And if we go back to the main page again, and we click academic programs, it will show you that the range of the other programs that are offered under the by the museums, for particularly for students of the university. So the website, I don't think you can see it. Okay, hang on. The website, in case you are interested, is museumsandcollections.unimel.edu.au. Here we go. Okay, so aside from objects, so in my research, I did not just focus on OBL. I did not just focus on artifacts. I studied the learning environment as a whole. And when I say learning environment, I wasn't only studying the galleries or the museum classrooms. My research focused on the museum as a whole, including corridors, foyer, lobby, and even spaces outside of the museum, like gardens, parks that were still within the premises of the museum. But my research also included learning spaces where museum educators go to for when they conduct outreach program. So for example, they go to schools, or they go to other community centers to conduct programs for students. So in my research, I found that these are the objects, these are the elements of the learning environments that museum educators use. So as you can see, educators do not limit themselves to just objects. They use technology, they use images and videos, they use text, wall text, or handout text. They also use the natural environment as well as the built environment. And in some instances, they use sensory stimulus, light, sound, temperature, taste, smell, as well as spatial attributes of the learning space. I'll go into that more deeply later. So it's not just what they used that was very important and useful for my research. It was actually how they used these elements that was quite valuable. So in the previous slide, I showed you the elements that they use to facilitate student learning. But how they use it, I call this pedagogical affordance, or possible uses of an element of a learning environment to facilitate learning of another individual. So during my research, I found 19 of these pedagogical affordances across the 9 sites that I 9 institutions that I conducted my research in. But it doesn't mean that these are the only elements that museum educators use. These are just the ones that I found in the research that I did. Now, the second question, how can educators use museums for deep learning? Now, I'm focusing not just on learning in general, but particularly on deep learning. What is deep learning? So if we go back to the description, if you remember the kind of learning that museums facilitate, you will notice that what they are describing is actually deep learning. While other types of learning will enable students to recall facts, concepts, or procedures, deep learning will equip them with the ability to apply what they previously learned in solving new problems. It has also been said that deep learning and 21st century competencies are important for students to attain academic success and later on professional success, achieve health and relationship skills, and finally participate in civic engagement. So one of the easiest way to explain deep learning is to describe what it is not. It's not rote learning or memorization of facts and figures so that students can earn high test scores in exams. So in my research, I developed curated learning, which is a pedagogical approach that involves the purposeful selection, manipulation, and use of elements within a learning environment to set up conditions for students' deep learning. Curated learning highlights the role of the museum educator in supporting students in enhancing their deep learning competencies. Furthermore, this approach acknowledges that the learning environment also plays a role in enabling museum educators in setting up these conditions. So from the data that I collected in my research, I distilled 6 principles that underpin curated learning, and I call them the 6 C's of curated learning. So I'll start with the first one, which is connected. So students' deep learning is supported when educators use the learning environment for connected learning. This is the first principle of curated learning. It means that connected means what we are doing for them when we conduct our learning programs is connected to the students' personal, academic, and civic lives. This means that their learning environment, the tools that they are using, and the lessons they are studying are aligned with their personal interest or relevant to what is happening in their community, their country, and the world. So an example of this was so most of the examples that I will be sharing with you for curated learning are not higher education examples because my research was focused on primary and secondary students. But that does not mean that you are not able to adopt this in in your learning programs. So one of the programs that here in in one of the art museums that I was conducting research in, they were looking at paintings. So in terms of, they were looking particularly at a painting of the bridge that is in, so the museum is in Melbourne, and the painting depicts a 19th century depiction of the a main thoroughfare in Melbourne. So what the educator did was he reminded them, that's the students, as they were looking at it and exploring the painting, he reminded them that they actually crossed, just on their way to the museum, they crossed that particular bridge on their way to the museum. So the educators selected specific objects in the museums that students can relate to. In fact, the ones that they just experienced, they just saw that morning on their way to the museum. So when museum educators use the learning environment to provide connections between what students were learning and the real world, such as when they use technology to help students connect with their cultural heritage and personal history, and when students were prompted to demonstrate what they know about climate change. Another program that that came out during my research was they were studying climate change. So instead of traditionally asking the students what they know about climate change, they had a mock interview set up, mock TV interview setup where someone was doing the interview, one of the students was doing the interview and they were interviewing a panel of fellow students who were supposedly experts in climate change. Another example of this is another example of finding connections to what they are learning is one of the museums converted their learning space into a gold rush town. So in Australia, they have the Australian Gold Rush, and it's one of the topics that are studied in primary school. So they converted the learning space into a gold rush town, and I'm not talking about fancy conversion. They used costumes. So this is they use role playing to help students understand how it is to live during the gold rush. So they provided, so it was a role playing game that was developed by the museum, and they dressed up the space temporarily every time that they have students who are going to participate in that particular program. So the second principle of curated learning is providing opportunities for various collaborative engagements. So student to student, student to teacher, and then teacher to teacher. I mentioned earlier about being able to provide students their own direction, agency in pursuing their learning. So this is aligned to that, and also the fact that learning is a collaborative, is a social endeavor. So by allowing students to work together, you are encouraging students to combine their knowledge and learn from each other. So in New Zealand, they have what they call, it's a Maori concept of ako. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but this concept removes the traditionally hierarchical structure of learning. So instead, everyone can be both learner and expert simultaneously. So this is one way of encouraging a non-hierarchical relationship in the learning environment by so one way of doing this is through the physical organization of space. So you're removing the front of the room where the teacher traditionally is, and you are also removing the rigidly arranged rows of tables and chairs. Many of the participating museum educators did not arrange their chairs inside their learning environment, inside their classrooms into rows, nor did they have a front of the room. So therefore, the way the museum educators curate their learning environment affects whether students can engage in social interaction and therefore affect their own ability to learn. So by but a caveat again is not so by removing the restrictions, the physical restrictions for them to be working on their own and putting them in groups, you are sort of encouraging them to collaborate, to work together. However, a caveat is that by putting together students in group, it does not automatically lead to collaborations. Educators need to deliberately create opportunities for collaborative learning. So one example of that is, museums can choose technology that require, museum educators can choose technology that require more than one students to work on and complete their task. Another example is one of the programs in a museum in Canberra, that's the capital of Australia. The educator removed all chairs and tables from the room, and she arranged the students to sit in a circle, and they have their worksheets with them, their materials. They had individual. They were exploring our artifacts, broken artifacts. So each student had their worksheet, and then they also had their own artifacts that they were supposed to document on their own. But because they weren't working on tables or individual chairs, the students can actually see what their classmates were doing. And eventually they figured out that their broken pieces would fit with their classmates' other broken pieces, and naturally they rearranged themselves. They sat together to combine their pieces to create a whole piece. So that was, although the educator admitted that that was not intentional, but because as a result of my research and my informing her about that, she purposely now does that in her school programs. So the third principle for curated learning espouses a continuous process of learning, assessment, and improvement for both students and teachers. This principle underscores the iterative and continuous nature of teaching and learning. Some of the participating museum educators in my research showed humility in articulating that they are not omniscient, that they don't know everything, and that they were open to learning from and with students. This openness to continued learning was exemplified in one of the museum when through their words and action in preparing for and while conducting the programs. For example, if they're conducting the program and they do not know the answer to a question that was posed to them by the student, they will admit that, oh, actually, I do not know that the answer to that. They will ask the class whether someone knows that, or declare that, okay, that's a very good question. Why don't we as a class try to find the answer to that? So there's no shame in not knowing the answer, and there's no pretension that you have all of the answers. But the follow-up for that though is, if you do promise the students that, okay, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to find out and I will get back to you. Just make sure that you do get back to the teacher so that students are maybe not disappointed that their questions are just thrown out the door. The other thing about this is that programs, learning programs in museums, there is an acknowledgement that they're not perfect, that they actually have, it's a continuous and iterative process of evaluating and refining the education program, the learning program. So many of the participants of the research were very receptive and quick to act on feedback from their fellow educators on how to improve succeeding sessions. So you don't only learn from, as I mentioned, you don't only learn from your students, students also learn from their fellow students, but museum educators also learn from fellow museum educators. The fourth principle of curated learning promotes creative use of elements within the learning environment, delivery of planned lessons, and solutions to spatial issues. Additionally, curated learning also advocates for creative ways of enabling students to demonstrate learning. So sorry. So the findings in my study aligns with what other researchers found, Dennis and O'Harris, who found that a better way for students to construct knowledge was to make them produce original work. So instead of giving them multiple choice or matching exams where they only reproduce knowledge gained from memorization of facts, several museum educators enabled students to demonstrate what they learned in the session by creating works such as tapestries, digital artworks, paintings, and videos. So for example, and another example for creativity is when some museums, when they travel to outside of the museum, some educators, when they travel outside of the museum, of course it'll be tricky to bring with them the original collection pieces. So what they have are replicas of the artifacts that they will be discussing with the students when they do their outreach program. So one of the museums here in Australia, they bring replicas of military, they discuss World War II, the Great War. So they bring with them replicas of military uniforms, supplies, and gears to teach about the war. They, of course, have to declare that these objects that they are showing the students are just replicas. But the value in that is that the students are able to physically touch the objects and explore these closely. So some museums have education collections. These are objects that are not part of the main museum collection, that are specifically used for education purposes, or used by the education department in conducting public programs, or they can be used in the galleries so that as part of interactive components of exhibition. So these are objects that are maybe duplicates or are not that precious, or even some replicas. For as long as you declare that it is a replica, that's all right. So another creative way of finding solutions to issues in museum is One museum actually hired a theater performer to train their teachers in using their voice and understand the space around them, how to use drama to be more effective educators. This museum is housed in a very brutalist building, so massive galleries, but very echoey. So they found that their museum educators were having such a difficulty being heard by the students, and they were damaging their voice box. So the museum hired a theater performer to train the teachers on how to perform when they are teaching how to use their body, their voice, the lights, and their surroundings in effectively engaging with students. The fifth principle of curated learning uphold the idea that there is no silver bullet, nor a one-size-fits-all solution to an enriched learning environment. Although there is a perception that deep learning is better than surface learning, I found in my study that both approaches are highly valuable. Students need both surface and deep knowledge. Student learning approaches exist in a continuum, and where the student is situated at a certain point in time depends on the context and their learning situation. So I also found that museum educators in my study also engage students in ways that allow them to move back and forth between this continuing. Many of the museum educators began their program with a discussion of, in a way to informally assess prior knowledge and interest of student. This way, the museum educators are able to determine a point from which they can move towards accomplishing their intended learning outcome. It also gave the museum educator a clearer idea on what information students already know and what they needed to do to provide the students with before diving deeper into the topic. So this principle disrupts the dichotomous view purporting that surface learning is bad while deep learning is good. Another dichotomy that curated learning challenges include the use of physical and digital tools and resources, and both digital and physical tools. So especially now with COVID, many of the museums are closed to the general public. Many field trips are not happening because, particularly in the Philippines, because schools are learning online. So if you are not able to provide students access to the physical objects because the galleries are closed, what can you do? You have to maximize the use of also your digital tools and resources. So the last principle of curated learning is that students' deep learning is supported when educators use the learning environment to create an atmosphere that is conducive to the construction of learning. This is critical and this is pivotal. This sixth principle serves as a keystone of curated learning. The previous 5 principles applied in concert with the sixth principle results to a greater impact on teaching and learning. A constructive learning environment creates conditions that is more conducive to applying the principles that I have previously discussed. To encourage continuous learning, museum educators need to cultivate a positive learning environment where students are encouraged to take risks and mistakes are not seen as failures, but as opportunities for learning. If any of you have ever heard of the term fail forward, this is very popular in tech and startup industries. Based on my research, um, um, emotions, the results of my research aligns with another research on the nature of learning, which says that emotions are integral to learning and that positive beliefs about themselves as learners is a core component for deep understanding and the ability to apply knowledge and skills to different contexts and situations. All right, so in summary, these are the 6 principles of curated learning. So students' deep learning is supported when educators use the learning environment for connected learning in a creative way to encourage continuous learning, to promote collaborative engagement, to suit a diversity of pedagogies, strategies, resources, and students' needs. And lastly, to create an atmosphere that is conducive to the construction of learning. So the third question that I hope to answer is, how important is it for HEIs to integrate learning in museums in their curriculum? So the short answer to that is very important. It's critical. In fact, if you want students that are equipped with 21st century skills and who cannot just survive, but also thrive in this rapidly changing world we now live in, you need to, universities need to integrate museums, learning in museums in their curriculum. So in the past, I don't know, for 40 minutes, I've been talking about evidence of why it's beneficial for students to learn in museums. But I think that the better question that I should be responding to is, how might HEI museums integrate museum learning in their university's curriculum? So I will share some strategies on how HEIs can possibly achieve this goal. But before I do that, I wanted to highlight 2 critical factors that enable or hinder the applicability of curated learning. So before I proceed to that, so my research collected data from museums, so educators facilitating students learning activities. The goal was for these strategies, for these principles to be applied to classroom teaching. But I hasten to add that these principles are actually applicable not just for students, but to other learners. So even for professional learnings and in learning spaces that are not just schools or museums, but in other learning spaces as well. So we can talk about professional learning spaces. So there are 2 critical factors that enable or hinder applicability of curated learning. First is the spatial factors. So these are educators' spatial awareness, the physical attributes of the learning environment, the ability and access to resources and spaces, the flexibility of the space, including storage spaces, as well as mobility of furniture and equipment. So the second factor is the organizational issues. So organizational issues such organizational structures, cultures, and policies profoundly influence the agency with which museum educators are able to select and manipulate their learning environment and elements within. So, and additionally, the level of support they receive for professional development enabled them to understand the qualities of their learning environment. And so what does this mean for HEI museums? So if you are in the process of constructing your museum, it's worth putting a lot of thought on how you plan your learning environments. And I'm not just talking about the exhibition galleries or dedicated activity spaces for workshops and all that, but also availability of storage spaces, for example, and the kind of equipment that you will be purchasing. So go towards more flexible equipment or elements and spaces. So for example, if one of for example, earlier I talked about that class that was that museum educator who removed all the tables and chairs from her classroom and had the students sit on the floor and work arranged in a circle. If she didn't have space to put away the tables and the chairs, she would not have been able to do that. So think about the importance also of the storage space. So your space is only flexible. The learning spaces can only be flexible based on what you put in it and how you design it. So if you already have a space, and if you already have a museum and you're not constructing a new facility, then explore spaces, how you can convert spaces to more to be more flexible and accommodate a variety of learning methods and learning approaches. And also explore spaces outside of the museum. So if you're in a university, don't limit yourself to the spaces within the university museum. Utilize the grounds, other spaces within the campus. The other thing that is worth thinking about is for university museums to actively participate in the university community. Involve yourself in policy reviews and engage with different faculties, not just the usual faculties that you engage with, or for example, if you're a history museum, you normally, it's automatic that you gravitate towards the history department. Explore other faculties or other departments that are not traditionally aligned with your museum's focus. Why is that? So these are some of the strategies that I offer. So the first one is to conduct a SWOT analysis. You need to understand and what you have, what your strengths and weaknesses are, and maximize your resources. So I'm not just talking about the resources within the museum, but also the resources of the university as well as the community. So for example, ask and identify what are the skills and expertise of your staff member. What subjects can they teach? Cecil Galicami talked about this, that one of the first things that they did was to study the curriculum of LaSalle Cavite and LaSalle Dasmariñas, and they found where they can match, so they identified where they can support faculty or courses. So it's important that you find what you can offer and leverage or maximize those. And remember also that your community is not just the museum. So if you have you have a specialized collection, chances are you have researchers, you have colleagues in that particular field, even collectors that may be good facilitators or speakers for specific programs that are aligned with some of the curricular goals of the university. For example, the Australian and New Zealand College of Anesthetists, they have this talk, they have a museum, the Geoffrey K Museum, and they invited someone from a different institution to talk about chloroform and serial killers. And the students, as far as I understand, the students specific students attend this talk and as part of their course. Another example for utilizing your community outside of just the museum is when I was when I was studying in the University of Florida, at one of the museums that the university had, the Harn Museum of Art, they when they invited a conservator to work on one of their collection, they used this as an opportunity to get that particular conservator to speak um, to to students. So they have a good relationship with the university as a museum studies program, but they opened it up to other students as well. So that's again another possibility for you to explore who are the people you work with that are outside of your core staff members. And of course the resource person has to agree that they're going to do that. Now it may be in the beginning an ad hoc thing, a one-time engagement. However, if depending, I guess, on the results of that, it can be and depending on how it is received by the faculty, it can be arranged. It can lead towards a more regular program that you have arranged with specific faculty members and courses. So leading to that is to cultivate partnerships and find champions within the university to help you embed yourselves in the curriculum of the university. You can start small, then expand. For example, at the Ian Potter Museum of the University of Melbourne, they established an academic programs unit, or APU, and this was intended to actively support undergraduate courses. And similar to what Cecil and her staff were doing at the LaSalle Museum, the curator of education identified specific courses within the curriculum of the university, and sat down with these faculty members to identify how they can work together and how the museum can support the course that they were teaching. So some of the courses that were that they were able to support include things like seeing the whole picture, sports coaching, theory and practice, advertising and promotions, and also interpreting ancient word. So the Ian Potter Museum has a dedicated space for displaying objects that are not usually on display. So again, when you're planning your space, or when you're if you want to create space and not be limited by the objects that are on exhibit, when you're creating programs, you can identify in a separate space where you can temporarily display objects that are relevant to the course that you are trying to support. That way, you're not limited to what's just on view. And it is most likely that museums will have a lot in their storage areas that never see the light of day because they don't align with exhibition themes that the museum has. So it's also one way of being able to bring out these precious objects that you have in your collection that normally are not explored to the general public. So to do this, you need to collaborate more closely and learn more about the collections that you have. The other one, the next one is to, oh, so I have to add there's another thing. So this program at the Ian Potter Museum was actually inspired by a program at the Yale Medical School of Medicine. It was done by initiated by Irvin Braverman all the way back in 1997. So he brought his dermatology students to Yale Center for British Art. The goal was to for them to look at objects, at artworks, to hone their skills in identifying and defining fine details. So as you can see, this is not your typical cohort of students that you bring to an art museum. So you are so this is about being going outside of your traditional box of your usual partnerships with departments. So here you have an art museum working with a science unit, a medicine unit, to help students hone their skills in observation and identifying fine details. And eventually this program became a standard course that medical students from Yale have to undergo. And it even developed into a program that that encourage empathy on of medical students. So whenever you do this program, so the third strategy is to always remember to document, and if you can, evaluate. So document what you are doing. And I mentioned earlier, one of the principles of curated learning is that it's a continuous process of refining and improving the program. So you continuously evaluate and document the programs that you're embarking on. And if you can, because you are a university, there will be researchers that you can probably partner with um, to um, to use the program as a research. This way, you have, when you bring this up to when you plan to scale the program, or promote it to, say, the university's leadership, you actually have proof of the value of the programs that you have already embarked on. So you have documentation as well as empirical evidence of the benefit of this programs that you're embarking on. And lastly is be bold. I keep mentioning that, color outside the line. Don't limit yourself to your usual partners. I mentioned earlier that there was an educator who was teaching German language, and she brought her students in a museum, in an art museum. And then we have here someone the Yale Medical School, and they're bringing their student again to an art museum to develop empathy and critical observation skills. So don't limit yourselves to who you normally have partnerships with. Explore what other opportunities there are, and that's why I mentioned earlier that you have to be actively participating in the university, because then you will learn who might be more inclined towards um, partnering with you for this kinds of endeavor. And with that, I am going to end my presentation. I hope you're still awake, and I hope you found value in what I have shared. This is my contact information. You can email me if you have additional questions. That's my Twitter handle, although I'm not very active lately on social media, so email would probably be better. And with that, I will end my screen and answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Villafranca, for that very informative presentation on the 6 Cs. No, thank you very much for this presentation. So we have a lot of questions pouring in from our participants. So we have in the chat box and there. So just a brief question from John Pedroso.
Mhm.
Or Eric Estioco, can they request a copy of your paper on curated learning, please?
Yes, the full thesis is actually available for download at the University of Melbourne. If you type in Minerva, I'll type in the chat. One moment. So if you type Minerva, this is the repository of thesis, and then you just type my name, Ethel Villafranca. It will take you to a page where you can download to a site where you can download the full PhD thesis. I just have to caution you that this is the full PhD thesis. It's more than 300 pages, I think. But they are chapters. You can skip the ones that you are not interested in. Additionally, I have a Figshare account. If you type Figshare and type in Ethel Villafranca, you will also see other mostly audiovisual materials that I make available that are related to my research.
All right, thank you, Dr. Villafranca. We actually downloaded your thesis. That was our background reading for today's session. So we would be, is it okay with you to share that with our
Of
participants?
course,
The PDF file.
it's publicly available. So because I am part of my research was part of publicly funded the Australian Research Council grant. Um, I am required to make it publicly available immediately. Unlike some PhD graduates who embargo their thesis because they want to publish later on. So mine is completely available online.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Villafranca. That's most generous. No, so for our participants, we have like 150 shortlisted participants for this webinar. We will just send this to you online via email. All right. Thank you. There's a question from John Pedroso. Dear Dr. Villafranca, I am Dr. John from West Visayas State University in Iloilo City, and he is teaching social studies major in teacher education. Can you give him a suggestion how to integrate these 6 Cs in his class? Can this be performance or task, big project for his students at the end of the semester? And he said that your research is very phenomenal.
Thank you for that, Dr. Pedroso. Definitely, it's highly possible to integrate apply curated learning in your uh, teacher education class. And in fact, I have given this talk to several um, classes, student education, teacher education students, in PNU and Miriam. I talked to them about curated learning and how it may be applied to the subject that they're studying. Like for example, one of the talk that I gave at PNU, the students were science teachers, so I focused specifically on science. For your question, teacher in social studies. Oh, it's so curated learning is more of an approach to teaching. I'm curious though if you're particularly interested in them learning how to apply curated learning in their own practice when they become teachers, or how you can apply curated learning in your own practice while you're teaching them. So if you can clarify that, yeah, that'll be great, and I can answer, I guess, more clearly your question.
Okay.
Additionally, you can get in touch with me and we can chat.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Philip Franca. There are more questions in our from YouTube, no, or sent via email by our some of our participants. So here are the questions. Number one, what do you think is the state of Philippine Museum in terms of their role in educational pedagogy?
Um, I um, I think that we still have loads to go. We still have a lot of we're I wouldn't say we're falling behind completely. I think we still have a lot to develop. In fact, the reason why I had to, for one, we don't have a museum studies degree in the Philippines. Definitely not a museum education degree in the Philippines. I had to go to the US to study museum education. And many, if you look at the education programs or the learning programs in museum, they're still very traditional, and we're still heavily didactic. We're still very teacher centered. So I mentioned in my talk about constructivist approach. It's more learner centered. So the teacher is not the only source of knowledge and information, and the students have agency in directing their own learning. So many of the programs that I have been seeing in museums in the Philippines still has a lot to go in terms of pivoting towards more learner-centered approach in teaching. We're still a little bit stuck on the fact that on traditional teaching approaches, and also the kind of programs that whenever I'm only talking about, I'm only focusing on student programs, because the topic for general public programs will be for tomorrow by Maya and Dr. De La Paz. But in terms of that, we still have a lot to go. But we do have some examples that we can look at for like Cecil Galicami has mentioned the things that they are doing in LaSalle. They are closely collaborating with faculty members in developing um, pro, um, um, programs for their students. The other way also, the other thing also is, um, like I mentioned, we don't really have a lot. We don't really have museum education um, training programs in the Philippines. It's it's very seldom that we have those. So if we're looking at um, professional development for museum educators in the Philippines, there are very few opportunities for that. So one thing I can recommend though is the other thing that I've noticed is we don't really have a strong community of museum educators where we can learn from each other. We do have like Facebook groups that's kind of become posting boards for cross posting news that we've read about that may be relevant to museums, or promoting our own individual museum programs. However, in terms of a community that learns from each other, I don't see that in the Philippines yet. And I think in lieu of professional training programs, developing that community where you can actually ask questions from fellow museum educators. And there are existing ones that are, I'm part of many communities. I continue to be part of the educator communities and museum communities in the US and also here in, and I'm part of groups that are specifically for asking questions. For example, you're a museum educator and you're going to, you want to evaluate a public program. You ask and get feedback from fellow educators on what they do. So it's a learning. It's more of a learning community rather than a posting board. That's a very long answer. I hope I answered your question.
It's all right. So, yeah, I think there's no as a degree yet for museum education. It's not yet in the Philippines, so we have to take trainings elsewhere to do this. No, so Dr. Villafranca, this is a related question for number two. You this one. So you mentioned museum educators or museum education. Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but this seems to be a new quote unquote profession in the Philippines, and many parts of the world are still in the process of gradually professionalizing museum educators. With this, who can be a museum educator and what training or experiences is needed? How do you think we can ensure the quality and credibility of museum education work? So this came from a question from one of our participants. So the question is a lot, no? One, um, it's not yet professionally the museum education is not professionalized. So the question is, who can be the museum educator and what are the training or experiences necessary for this? That's the number
Okay.
one question.
So, in response to the question that it's a new field, no, actually, it's not. It's not a new field in the Philippines and overseas. There are museum educators as a profession has been around. I don't have the date exactly with me, but there are professional bodies of museum educators overseas. Of course, the US is far ahead in terms of museum in the museum field, but museum education is not a new field. But in the Philippines, it is not new. A lot of museums would have educators. They probably don't have the title museum educators, but museums inherently are educational institutions, so they have educators. These are the people, and and I'm not only talking about titles, people who have titles museum educator. Educators, museum educators as a role encompasses those who are, docents, those who facilitate workshops in museums. So they're not limited to staff members whose sole titles are museum educator or education managers. In terms of who can be educators, I don't have a quick answer to that because there are. I suppose you can be a museum educator from, you can approach museum education as a career from different pathways. I myself, I have an undergraduate degree in Philippine arts from the University of the Philippines, but um, my first role at the as a professional was as museum assistant, museum education assistant at the Ayala Museum. So that was my pathway towards museum education. I must admit that when I uh, even our degree, we didn't even have a subject in our program focused on museum education. So when I started in 1998 at the Ayala Museum, uh, I had very limited knowledge or an understanding about museum education or learning in museums. In fact, that was the reason why I went on a fellowship to the US. I applied for a fellowship at the Asian Cultural Council, and I was given a grant to explore museum education programs in about 80 museums across the United States. So I was there for 6 months, just hopping to museum, talking to museum educators. This was in 2001, and the reason why I pursued a PhD in this topic is because, or a master's in museum education, is because it was eye opening, that experience seeing education programs in more than 80 museums. However, I wanted to understand why do these education programs work? Why do how what's I didn't have the theoretical, so I didn't have the opportunity to understand the theoretical backing on why the museums do things this way and why these things work versus that. So that's why I did my degree in museum education. um, what kind of training? Well, there are museum education trainings overseas. In lieu of that, you can, as I mentioned, create a community of museum educators and maybe collaborate in inviting someone who specializes in museum education or museum learning to work with you as a group to conduct training programs. What else? And learn from each other. That's what I could see could be has a really great potential for advancing the museum education field in the Philippines. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you so much. So there's a question again, a follow-up question here. In planning and curating a museum exhibition, does the curator also take in the role of a museum educator? Can curators wear both hats, or should museums have different individuals designated as curator and a museum educator? There's a note here whether that's also a curator of education for museums. So is that so? Those are two questions from an
Okay, so
anonymous attendee.
long and short is it depends on the structure of your museum. How big is your museum? How big is your staff? While what I would say that there's if you because museums, if museums are educational institution, someone takes on that educator role. They may not have the museum educator or education manager title, but someone in the museum will be taken on that role as educators. This can be curators. So when museums organize exhibitions, it's with the intention that it's a learning opportunity for visitors. So yes, you can have a separate one. Most museums would have a separate curator focused on exhibitions, and an educator. And this depends on how big your museum is, how big your audience are. Because if you're a small museum, you're just starting out, and you don't anticipate having students or school groups, then it might be that you just have a curator, and your curator is the one looking after the educational component of the museum. However, bear in mind that the skills of a curator, the skills necessary for um, organizing, curating an exhibition, and um, creating public programs or educational programs are are different. They're related, but they are different. So the skills, someone may not have, one person may not have the skill to cover both roles, but it is fairly common in small museums that staff members multitask. So, for example, when I was working at Lopez Museum, I was looking after the education unit of the museum. So I was doing the public program, school program, etc., etc. But I was also co-curator of the museum. I had a co-curator. I couldn't take it on full time, um, but because one uh, it's a full on job. So I was admin. I wear many hats. I wore many hats. I was admin, and then education, and then I was partly curator also of back when I was working at the Lopez Museum. So it depends. There's no easy answer to that. It really depends on the context of your institution. But in an ideal setup, you will have someone who is focused on exhibitions, and then you have someone who's focused on education, simply because if you want to upskill them, if you want to send them to training, then their skills are very specific.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Villafranca. So we have a lot of questions, if you can see at the Q&A. Okay, so from an anonymous attendee, since most startup museums are in the webinar, can you share the things we most need to do to begin having a museum education program in our startup museums?
So when you are talking about museum education programs, are you particularly focusing on student programs or public programs? So again, I identified, if you can clarify that, because if you're pertaining to public programs, that's a topic for tomorrow. I don't want to preempt what they are going to talk about. But if you're particularly interested in school programs, then what I would recommend is what I talked about earlier, is learn about the curriculum of of your your university. I'm assuming that that
It
the
could be,
attendee is not from HEI.
most of them are from HEI. So I think
Okay.
they are starting up a museum. So what kind of practical tips, or how do you bring this down for them? Like, what are the things
Okay.
needed to
Yeah.
begin?
As I mentioned earlier, study if you want to create education programs that are for the students of your university. One good way is to study the curriculum and find ways where you can support specific topics under specific courses. So that's the very first step, and Cecil talked about this before. That way, you're not. This is part of when you are designing exhibitions. When you are designing exhibitions. Sorry, when you are designing education programs, you understand your target audience. So if your target audience are the students of the university, then you align. You have to find out what their needs are. Ideally, you could talk to specific um, faculty members, so that you're not designing in in a vacuum. So it's more tailored towards what they really need, and not based on what you assume they need. And then you can take it from there.
Okay, so yeah, it's important to look at the kind of programs that are also offered in the universities, whether you have a museology program or an allied course that are offered in your universities. Like here at UP Baguio, we have an elective course of museology last semester that was offered. So how can museum integrate into the curriculum, no? Or do you want to propose a new curriculum based on museology, advanced museology, or intro to museology? So you can do that. We have done that at UP Baguio also, no, offering us it as a course, but eventually it has to level up to something like a certificate or a program, no? Okay, there's a question from Alicia Esguerra. Thank you, Dr. Villafranca, for sharing your knowledge and expertise. May we ask the active museum educators learning community in the Philippines, which you are a part of, and can we join these groups? No, from
For
Alicia.
Alicia, unfortunately, I have not found an active museum education community group in the Philippines that I could join. So maybe you guys can start. And I am part of other communities in other countries. But you guys can start. You initiate it, and I
Yes.
gladly join.
Okay, thank you. From Kelly Ramos from Cagayan de Oro, would you have any good examples of online museum learning programs, particularly in HEIs?
A lot. There are actually a lot. One. Well, um, I there are a lot of examples. Whether they're good or effective, I am not in a position to say, because unless I have evaluated them or I have gone through them, I won't be able to say. But one of the Dr. Patrick Flores actually talked about the fact that they developed resources for they develop as part of their exhibition. They develop resources for educators in their museum. The other one is um, the University of Melbourne that I showed earlier. And if you go to university museums, you will notably find examples of educational resources that they have developed. Um, if you send me that question again via email, I could probably look at and put together links that they can explore.
All right. So we can send that to you, Dr. Villafranca, for that question. So there are more questions that I noted from our email. So there's another question about blurring genre. So you mentioned earlier about education programs or activities that are conducted outside of the classroom, and the museums are effective way of doing education in the physical sense. No, the challenge now is that we are now in the pandemic. How do we go about this kind of museum education in the new normal?
Okay. So okay. So I've been thinking about this because I finished my PhD before the pandemic, and then when the pandemic happened and everything shifted to online learning or asynchronous and synchronous teaching and learning, I had to think long and hard and thought, maybe my research is no longer relevant. Like, hindi yata relevant. But then I realized that the principles actually apply not just for physical learning, but the principles are general enough that they're not limited to. And I mentioned this in one of the principles of curated learning, that it's not just the physical but also the digital. These principles can be applied even if you are not providing physical engagement or the physical space to engage with students. One one um, One opportunity to address the issue now with not having face-to-face classroom is to develop the educational resources uh, for of your museum to offer to teachers in general. Look at the examples that I showed at the University of Melbourne, and find links on specific ways that they can align that with what students are learning. The other thing also is, I think the Chinatown Museum, they run a program maybe last year, a webinar on for museum education. And one of the things that really struck me about the program is the fact that museums are actually willing to work with school teachers. And so my suggestion is, promote yourself as a resource, not just a physical resource for educators, for teachers, but also an online. Develop with them so you can support them in using your collection to enhance how they're teaching. And one way of doing that is to develop identifying objects in your collection that are aligned with some topics that students are learning in school, and being open to the idea that you can tweak and you can customize programs based on their need. I used to do that when I was working in both Ayala Museum and Lopez Museum. Some teachers would call us up and ask, so my students are learning this, and so are there do you have programs that they can attend? And so I would talk to them and develop programs with them, with specifically with the teacher. And again, there are factors to consider. One is do you have the manpower to do that? So if you don't have a dedicated person who does that, or someone who's interested, who has the time to do that, then it's I guess it's not possible. But these are just ideas that you can explore, and depending on the priorities of your institution, these are things that you can consider when you create the structure of your institution, as well as when you plan out your programming.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Villafranca. There's a question related to that from an anonymous attendee. Is there a possibility to integrate museum education or the 6 Cs in basic education or higher education in different disciplines? Is there a possibility how we can integrate seamlessly in the Philippine curriculum? What you have mentioned.
I'm not sure about how it can be integrated in the Philippine curriculum, considering that we've just transitioned to K to 12. It could be, as I said, I've given talks to education students in different universities about curated learning, and yes, definitely it is a possibility. It can be curated learning can be a subject matter offered by a university that teachers, student teachers can learn about. I don't know if it can be done on a national level, but if you have institutions that, if you are part of an institution that is looking at revamping their basic education curriculum, you can include that as one of the subject matters that the courses that students can learn. When I was doing my master's in Florida, one of the most interesting class that I attended, and this is for master students. Um, yeah, they are education masters, masters in education students. And I joined the class. I registered in the class because I was, we had the freedom to take classes. The way the program of my master's degree was structured is we could take any class within the university that aligns with the focus of our master's degree. So I took classes under the College of Education. So one of the classes that I attended was focused on science education in informal learning. So I was the only one who has a museum background in that class. The rest are student education students. And the topic of the course was how to use museums, aquaria, theme parks, and maximize that to for student learning. So it's definitely a possibility. It's just a matter of which university is interested in doing that.
Okay, thank you so much. There's a question here about possible training. Kailan ba kayo babalik, Dr. Ethel? Okay, so to have this
COVID.
certificate, no? So from Eric S. Tioco, any chance, Dr. Villafranca, to run a certificate course on curated learning so we can learn more about this?
Well, if it's a face-to-face program, it depends on, you know, the pandemic. But if it's an online one, yeah, get in touch. I have been running. So every time I go home to the Philippines, I share updates about my research. And I've conducted programs for Bahay Chinoy, and workshops for Bahay Chinoy, Museo de la Salle. I always talk about my research because my lament before was, okay, so the topic of my research, the data I collected are from New Zealand and Australia. And I always ask myself, so how can how can my home country benefit from the work, the knowledge that I'm generating from my research? So I always conduct, whenever I come home or whenever I get invited, I always share what knowledge I have. I have.
Okay, so there's another question here from our YouTube viewer. Dr. Ethel, how do you bring down the educational or museum education and its academic contents to a public audience? I think this is a question for tomorrow.
Yes, it's for tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll just carry that for tomorrow's session. Okay, from Vesper Sheras, question, is there any way in which you could assist HEIs to have a special training for faculty of HEIs offering Bachelor of Culture and the Arts under the teacher education degree, since this is a new program and most courses do not have modules and other instructional materials? Your talk today gave us a glimpse on how this approach can help teacher educators.
Yes, definitely willing and able to help with that. Uh, I recently concluded. No, it has nothing to do with museum education. So last trimester, I was part of the Philippine Women University's faculty. I taught a course on curating exhibitions, and I've never taught that class um, online before. So the whole time that I've conducted workshops and training for museum practitioners and other practitioners about curating exhibition, it was done face to face, and it was challenging, but that experience of conducting it online made me realize that yeah, if you are able to conduct a program on space, on managing space, curating space online, that definitely you are able to conduct programs for on education online. In fact, this is one of the things that I have. Um, I do have close friends in the museum field in the Philippines. So we've had talks about creating we call it so now it's I guess the Philippines is familiar with asynchronous and synchronous programs, but more of a certificate program, a certificate or a graduate program for focused on museum practitioners, and it will be both face to face and online. So yes, definitely there are it is possible to do that. It's just a matter of really pursuing it and finding an institution willing to do it, because willing to actually take on that responsibility to put it together, because as far as I understand from Ateneo and from LaSalle and definitely from UP, it may take a year or so to propose a program or a curriculum. But I think it's high time that the museum field in the Philippines address the lack of training programs for museum educators.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Villafranca. One more last question. So most of our participants are startup museums, and some already have established museums now all over the Philippines. So if you, for instance, if you design a museum, and we discussed this in the previous session in level one, what kind of space should be available for the museum education? Like if you have the exhibition halls, you have the visible storage, you have whatever. So do you need an extra space dedicated to museum education, and what would that be?
Definitely, most of the museums I've worked for have dedicated, they call it museum classrooms, and these are flexible spaces, and you'll see this in a lot of museums. Um, they would have spaces that are dedicated for learning programs, education programs. The reason for that is because if you have a group of say 20, 30 students, and they are um, they are engaged in an activity, you don't want other people to be disturbing them. So while yes, you can conduct programs in galleries and other spaces in the museum. I mentioned lobbies. I've seen that in my research. There are learning activities done in hallways, lobbies, galleries. A dedicated space is also necessary, because then you can curate that space depending on the goal of the objective of the program that you are conducting. So like I mentioned, you can design space to be flexible. It can Some of the museums that I have seen would I have seen have spaces that can become big classrooms, or divided up into smaller classrooms. Some open up into the gallery, some close. So some are adjacent to a gallery. Some of the spaces have Velcro walls, so that if the educators would like to put visual aids, they can easily do so. And I also mentioned that the museum here, the Ian Potter Museum, they have a dedicated space for education, for displaying and for displaying objects that are not on exhibit. Additionally, if you have any plans of conducting lectures or talks, then chances are you don't want to do that in a gallery. So you want that in a in a space that is exclusive to that for that particular time.
Yeah, for Museo Cordillera, it has multiple spaces for museum education learning. We have the visible storage room where we have objects not on display, and we also have some replicas, and we allow our visitors to handle some of these replicas. And we also have a library, uh, an AVR, and a classroom for these purposes. No? So it's good to have multiple spaces also for museum education.
And
All
also,
right.
for example, so lastly lang, so for example, if you're an art museum and you want to conduct art programs, definitely you need to have facilities for that. You need to have sink, access to water, and things like that. And if you have presentations, you have to have audiovisual equipment and things like that. So if you plan to have education programs or learning programs, definitely have space for that, or
Right.
spaces.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Dr. Villafranca, for spending your morning, afternoon with us for this very productive talk on museum webinar. I hope we can organize with Museo Cordillera with you museum education training, maybe level 3 or in year 2 of this project with the Commission on Higher Education. So a lot of our participants are museum educators in that sense because they're part of the institution and of course museums as well. So do you have some last words to our participants on how to go about this?
Um, uh, I think because take advantage of the communities that you are part of. And I've mentioned it, I can't say it enough, that create that community for learning from each other and with each other. The other thing is maximize, explore other museums, talk to other educators. When I travel, I go to museums and look at their education programs. I also spend time looking at what other museums are offering, not just in the Philippines. And now that we have access to the internet, it's easier to see what's going on out there. So keep your eyes and ears open. It may be that don't be intimidated um, by what other museums are doing. It may be that you can't do it the same way they are doing things, but you can use those as inspirations for your own programs that are specifically designed for your for your own context. So one of the 6 C's of curated learning is creative. So be creative in designing learning programs in your museum.
Dr. Villafranca, again, thank you for the contribution. I hope you can come back here in the Philippines and we can collaborate with you for a training with our HEI participants out there all over the Philippines. All right, salamat po. And then tomorrow, thank you, Dr. Ethel. All right, so tomorrow we will have Mea C, Carmelea Ang C, and Dr. Cecilia De La Paz will talk about public programs, no, for our university museum. So Professor Mea C will talk about museums as sites of cultural tourism. And Cecilia De La Paz will talk about managing museums and program collaterals, no, for your university museum. And we also would like to announce to our participants that next week will be our last day for okay. So all right. So we have on March 31, 2021, we will have the last day for our museum training. This will be composed of the closing program and then the reiteration of the museum exercises for the museum exercises for the museum. No, for So for this webinar, it's not only just listening to the museum webinars, but also to carry out exercises to help your museums. And lastly, there will also be an orientation and briefing on level 3 for MMT for our training. Okay, so thank you so much and see you all tomorrow. On March 31. And we thank Dr. Ethel Villafranca for joining us this morning. Thank you. By the way, please don't forget to sign in our feedback form so you can get a certificate of completion for today's webinar. Thank you very much and see you all next week.